In the year 1274, Kublai Khan tried to invade Japan. He brought a fleet of 13,000 men on ships to Japan. However, the ships never made it to Japan. In a massive typhoon, all of the ships were wiped out in an attack that was surely going to devastate Japanese history. In 1281, he tried again. However, the exact same thing happened. A typhoon swept through his forces, making sure that they never made it to the mainland of Japan. History tends to repeat itself, and I've noticed while playing the One Piece card game that although it won't always be exactly the same, a lot of the times the way that the meta progresses from the Eastern set and the Western set tends to be very similar. As such, in this video I'm going to be going over the history of OP09 and how it evolved into what we ended up seeing at the end. I've documented the evolution of the Japanese meta in real time as it came out over the last couple of months. And if you guys want to see this video but longer, then you can technically go and watch those videos as they came out, although of course they will be speaking in the present tense. This video is going to be condensing that sort of information into a digestible format so that maybe you know what to expect. It won't always be exactly the same, but the meta moved significantly in OP09, and I'm actually noticing that it's starting the same way that Japanese meta started in the West. Let's start with the very early Japanese meta. The early Japanese meta was dominated by Shanks. Shanks was running rampant due to the fact that he was very simple to play, but also very powerful. Many decks that were relevant in OP08 just could not stand up to Shanks' very simple set of moves where he plays one thing per turn, eventually closing out the game with the 10-cost Shanks. Shanks lists then and now still have very interesting properties. Shanks' leader ability allows him to build the deck in two different ways. If you play towards a more aggressive plan, that means that you're using cards that have rush. These rush cards that rest themselves generally are not very strong in other decks, but due to the fact that Shanks' leader ability can minus the opponent's power by 1,000 once per turn, it actually makes the value of rush characters a lot higher because it's much easier to defend these characters. In the early game where you're resting your characters such as Rush Zoro and Rush 5-cost Luffy, the opponent struggles to take back your board more because in the early game it's harder to put on more dong or hit from above because your power lines are so similar. Shanks' leader ability has a lot of value in the early game, which is why you can choose to play towards this rush style and defend your board as you try to push over the opponent. On the other side, you can play a defensive Shanks. Playing a more control-focused Shanks allows you to use your leader ability in the early game to help you survive until the late game, where you start playing these strong 10-cost characters. Whether the Shanks player is using his leader ability to help support the way that he's trying to play the game, or to cover for the weaknesses until he gets to a point where he's strong, both of these deck lists were viable at some point in Japan. In the early meta, the Rush Shanks was very popular. However, people noticed that the Rush Shanks build actually lost to the Control Shanks build due to the fact that things like Lucky Roo, 5-cost Yasop, and eventually being able to clear the opponent's Rush Shanks with your KO Shanks if you were to play a Building Snake the turn before made it very difficult for the Rush Shanks version to actually finish out the game before the Control Shanks version could come online. Shanks' dominance made the meta move. Due to the fact that Shanks only plays one card per turn, he's actually quite weak against black decks that control the board. As such, Lucci was for a time very popular due to the fact that he still had a decent Doflamingo matchup as well as a very winning Shanks matchup. In this early meta where we had lots of Shanks, Lucci, and Blue Doflamingo, one deck that started to show up a lot was Purple Luffy. People discovered that the current version of Blue Doflamingo would lose very hard to Purple Luffy due to the fact that he'd play in a very similar way to Doflamingo, where he plays very high value, high power characters on the board. However, Purple Luffy's characters were just bigger than the ones that Blue Doflamingo played. As such, if the game could go long enough, which it was perfectly capable of due to the fact that we now have Gum Gum Giant in Purple Luffy, in this way, Purple Luffy, just due to the fact that he has so much consistency and so much power, was able to overrun many of the opponents that it faced. Even Lucci did not have a cakewalk against Purple Luffy due to the fact that Purple Luffy with his 7-cost Rufitaro could play a 7-cost and a 5-cost on what should be his 5-dong turn. In this way, if you could just play multiple Rufitaro in a row, then the Lucci matchup could actually become favored for the Purple Luffy player. And as such, these four decks established themselves as the best in the very early meta. In the early meta, we saw lots of Shanks winning in many tournaments, and we only saw murmurs of Blue Doflamingo being the strongest deck. However, I think that good players knew that Blue Doflamingo was the best deck, and just needed more time to actually prove it due to the fact that the Shanks matchup was a little bit annoying in the beginning. Blue Doflamingo players generally were playing a more simple mid-range list. However, people discovered that this list ended up losing to Purple Luffy as well as Shanks. So Blue Doflamingo players adapted. Blue Doflamingo players ended up putting in the 2-cost Teach, which now you see everywhere. At the start of OP09, people did not really run this card due to the fact that it was reducing your resources in your hand. However, the card is extremely powerful, especially in the mirror, due to the fact that it can accelerate your game plan. However, due to the fact that Blue Doflamingo players were starting to tech in the 2-cost Teach to not only deal with the mirror, but also the Shanks and Purple Luffy matchup, both of these decks in Purple Luffy and Shanks started to come down in play rate. For a while, you actually did not see that much Shanks in the meta. In this meta, where Shanks was very low priority, one deck appeared out of nowhere to suddenly take center stage. That deck is Green Bonnie. Green Bonnie is a deck that, although struggles very heavily into decks such as Shanks or Blackbeard, in a meta where these decks aren't as prominent, she is exceptionally powerful due to the fact that she has an extremely good matchup into Purple Luffy and a slightly winning matchup into Blue Doflamingo. It was during this time that there was an official 3-on-3 that I went to. For this 3-on-3, the 3 decks that we brought were Blue Doflamingo, which I played, Green Bonnie, and then our wild card, weirdly, was Red Shanks. We thought that in this meta, where many people aren't playing Red Shanks, we could play an aggressive version of Red Shanks that still has the tools to deal with Green Bonnie and do quite well due to the fact a read was that Bonnie would be extremely high priority and Shanks is a very good Bonnie matchup. Unfortunately, we didn't end up doing that well in the 3v3, mostly because of me just being terrible at Doflamingo on the day. But at the time, we believed that these were the correct decks to bring, and I still stand by that. However, it was due to this rise of Bonnie that we saw a rise of what could have been one of the most terrifying decks in the OP09 meta, Blackbeard. Blackbeard as a deck completely shuts out decks such as Lucci and Bonnie and had a very good matchup into the current version of Red Shanks. As such, for 3 weeks in a row, we saw Blackbeard in the finals of the championships, winning 2 of them. Blackbeard was a deck that many people weren't used to playing against and was very good into the current meta. From then, Shanks players adapted to put in the 8-cost dragon into their deck to deal with the matchup, bringing it closer to 50-50 once again. The one reason why Teach did not completely dominate the meta was thanks to Blue Doflamingo. Blue Doflamingo was just a matchup that Teach could not win. Although it's not lost, there is no way that you could tech the Teach deck to make it winning against Blue Doflamingo, and as such, we never saw Teach become the best deck, but we always were considering him to be the second, maybe third best deck in the meta. Doflamingo was an extremely fast deck, and Shanks and Teach are both decks that become stronger as the game goes on. However, the way in which they control the game is completely different. Shanks tends to clear one thing per turn until he eventually starts playing his 10-cost Shanks, and then Teach also clears one thing per turn until he plays his 10. Okay, they're a little bit similar. But the key difference was that against Shanks, you can use on-play effects, but against Teach, you can't. This means that decks such as Lucci, who had very good Shanks matchups, have extremely bad Teach matchups. As such, nearly every single deck needed to put in some sort of tech card to deal with Teach. Before Teach established itself as a huge meta threat, Shanks players weren't running the 8-cost Dragon. Lucci players weren't running the 9-cost Kaido. Black Yellow Luffy players weren't running the 6-cost Kingdom Come. In the meta where people weren't respecting the threat of Teach, Teach was the strongest deck. However, as the meta started to settle down and people started to respect Teach as a meta threat, people started to tech for Teach, making his standings come down a little bit. This is probably the reason why you might not end up seeing that much Teach in the early meta, but the second that people stop respecting it as a threat, he will come back. In the meantime, Shanks, who now found himself losing to Blue Doflamingo more often than not, was trying to find techs for this matchup as well. One player found Red Hawk and did very well in a championship with it, making it so that Shanks, once again, was prominent in the meta. Before Red Hawk entered the build, people just were not playing Shanks due to the fact that it would just lose into things such as Teach, as well as Blue Doflamingo. However, thanks to Red Hawk and 8-cost Dragon, these two matchups were not as bad as they once were before, making Shanks' play rate come back up again. In this way, Shanks did something very unique where he was the most prominent deck at the beginning of the meta, completely disappeared for about half of the meta, and came back at the end of the meta again to become the second most prominent deck after Doflamingo. This brings us to where we are now. The Japanese OP09 meta has finished, and I'll be putting up some deck lists for the final lists that I ended up on, and hopefully you can use them as starting points. I think that through this video you can understand why some cards exist in these lists, and through this knowledge you can actually decide to change your tech cards. For example, if there are no Teaches in the meta, you don't really need to run the 8-cost Dragon in Shanks. Although it's a feel-good card, there are many other cards that can be very beneficial. Though these decks were the center of the meta, as you can see, many decks came and went into the meta. We even had a brief period of time where Bella Betty was considered very highly, but this was before people really started to figure out Blue Doflamingo. I will be putting out a video very soon on some of these more unique decks that people ended up doing quite well with in championships, and if you guys are interested in that, make sure to subscribe. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope that the backdrop was quite nice, because if I'm by the ocean, I need to film a One Piece card game, I feel. Speaking of which, my name also means ocean. Kai. It's like Kai in Kaizoku. I don't need to know that. I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.